originally when I was told about this, I was asked about giving Chris some props. He doesn't really need them from me, but I do have one story about him that I want to pass on because it's something I don't give credit to him.
Sword of omens, come to my hand. I, Lion-O, command it. Thundercats, ho! And you're watching the Dorkening.
Because it's really my credit, it's my book. But one of the things in the old days, when companies used to have offices, and offices you could go into, and we all went into the offices in New York all the time, DC and Marvel. It's not so true now because of COVID. It changed the way business gets done in comics. But before that, there were offices for both companies, and if you worked for either one or the other, you took your work in before the days of scanning and computers. The physical work, the actual physical pages, had to go into the office to turn into your editor so they could be copied, colored, printed, lettered. They were back and forth to inkers, back and forth to letterers, back and forth to pencilers, and so on. So it gave you a chance to be in the office and see people a lot. So all the people in my generation and the older generations before me are all people that I knew. I wasn't as friendly with some as with others, but I knew them all really well. And it was great. Comics was, in some ways, as much a social affair as it was a professional one. The folks that you worked with were your friends. You hung out together after hours. You went to movies together, dinner together, all that stuff. Conventions for us kind of recapture a little bit because we get to go out to dinner again with some of our friends we don't see hardly ever anymore. So given that, one of the things we also would do is we would go into the office and you'd bump into somebody like Chris, and Chris would give you the next 5 years of X-Men continuity as you talked for an hour. But to be perfectly fair, I would then give him the next 5 years of Thor continuity at the same rate. So we were talking once about one of the stories I was going to do. I was doing a story about Balder. For those of you who haven't read it, I put Balder through the ringer just because it was fun. And he got way overweight. He'd done some awful stuff. And eventually Odin asks him for a favor. And Odin Odin knows that bad stuff's coming. He wants Balder to go and talk to Loki to see if they can enlist Loki's aid. And Loki, of course, is pretty much on his own, doesn't care about anybody else. So Balder goes, makes the trip there. It's not an easy trip. He gets there. He explains to Loki how important this all is. And essentially, after listening to him, Loki blows him off. He blows him off as cruelly as possible. And finally, Balder loses it. And he pulls, by the way, this is a spoiler warning if you have not read it. I know the comic's 30-some years, almost 40 years old now, so now I don't care. If you haven't read it, I'm sorry, because I am going to tell you what happens. Balder finally freaks out, pulls out his sword, and cuts off Loki's head. And runs out of the building screaming, as it were, and rides off in the desert into self-imposed exile. Loki's headless body is standing there. The head is sitting on the ground. It fell neck down, which is a good thing, so it's just sitting there with the head up. And then after a moment, the body bends over, and it picks up the head, and it reattaches itself. After all, Loki is a sorcerer. This is his job. So I'm really delighted by that story. I thought it worked out great for Loki. I thought it was funny for Balder. It was a good character bit for both for Balder and for Loki. And the reason that happened that way, really, because I talked to Chris Claremont in the office. I described the story that you'd heard up to the point where Balder cuts his head off. What I had originally was that Balder finally clocks Loki, pulls his sword out, and drives it down, but he ends up driving it down right into the floor next to his head, maybe clips his ear, but doesn't really cut his head off. And Chris said, "Oh man, I thought you were going to cut his head off." And I said, "Fuck." Probably in those exact words. I'm sorry, are there any kids here? Well, I'm sorry. But so I just thought, all right, I'm terribly sorry. No, he's playing a video game, I'm good. So I rewrote my ending of my story. That's the way the story came out. If we did not have the offices back in the old days and the social interactions with all of us and talk to each other, editors as well as freelancers in the offices, that story would not have been as good as it was. So I want to thank Chris for giving me the idea. I have occasionally credited him once in a blue moon at conventions, but not very often because I want people to think I'm brilliant, not that Chris is brilliant. So thank you very much, Chris. That was my story. Thanks, pal.
Walt Simonson, everybody. Another Marvel legend, absolutely. Look at
I
him.
use the quarter of the time anyway, so.
All right. No, you're like Bob Hope. Yeah, I'm taping a special down the street. I just want to say hello.
Thanks, guys.
Wait, Walter, I just had this Loki idea.
Now I can record it on my phone.
Oh my God, the invisible phone.
Thanks, Walter. Outstanding, man.
Excelsior!